Welcome everyone. It's time for another true crime episode. As always, comment down below where you are listening from and what time it is. Also, like and subscribe. All of these things are very important for the channel growth and to reach larger audiences. Let's get to it. Long before Susan Berman's name ever appeared in a police file, there was the Durst family, a dynasty built on New York real estate and insulated by wealth. The Durst organization was one of Manhattan's power brokers, its offices, apartments, and skyscrapers shaping the city skyline. The patriarch, Seymour Durst, was known for his sharp instincts and stricter values. He wanted his eldest son, Robert, to follow in his footsteps. But Robert was different. He wasn't the social or business-minded heir Seymour wanted. He hated meetings, distrusted people, and seemed detached from family life. His younger brother Douglas was more conventional and willing to play by the corporate rules. As the years went on, the divide between the brothers grew. Douglas was in line for control of the empire, while Robert drifted further away. Robert's childhood had been marked by a trauma that those who knew him said he never escaped. When he was 7, he witnessed his mother's death. Accounts differ on whether he actually saw her fall or whether memory blurred with imagination, but the result was the same: guilt and confusion that haunted him for life. Family members described him as withdrawn, quick to anger, and prone to odd behaviors. In that emotional distance lay the foundation for decades of erratic choices. At UCLA in the 1960s, far from the formal Durst world, Robert found someone who seemed to understand him: Susan Berman. She was everything he wasn't: extroverted, witty, and unabashedly open about her mob legacy. Susan seemed to admire his awkwardness. She said he was weird, in a good way. Over long dinners and study sessions, they formed a bond that would endure for decades. Yet even in college, friends noticed something off about Robert, how suddenly his mood could change, how those around him sometimes felt more like props in his private story than real people. After graduation, Robert returned to New York, trying to fit into the family business. His father pushed him to take on more responsibility, but Robert resented the pressure. He preferred anonymity, often skipping meetings and ignoring calls. In 1972, he met Kathy McCormack, a young medical student from Long Island. She was bright, charming, and ambitious. Against her family's initial hesitation, Kathy fell for him. Their marriage began like a fairy tale, wrapped in privilege and spontaneity. They lived between Manhattan and the Durst's country homes, but cracks formed quickly. Robert discouraged her career ambitions. When Kathy began medical school, he complained about the time she spent away. Friends of Kathy's later remembered bruises she struggled to explain. Others said she confided fears about her safety, but didn't want to walk away from the life she'd entered. By the early 1980s, the relationship had turned toxic. Police reports and witness statements later suggested repeated altercations and isolation. The Durst family, known for protecting its image, wanted scandal kept quiet. Still, whispers spread among Kathy's circle that she was planning to leave Robert and that she was scared of how he might react. In January 1982, Kathy disappeared. Robert told police he last saw her that Sunday night, claiming he had driven her to the train station so she could return to the city from their South Salem home. According to his version, she called him later from their Manhattan apartment, but no one else ever saw or heard from her again. At first, the disappearance drew little press attention. Missing wives of wealthy men didn't fit the usual media mold, but Kathy's friends wouldn't let it drop. They filed missing person reports, spoke to reporters, and pressed the police to look closer at Robert. When neighbors came forward about strange noises and a possible argument that night, suspicions deepened. The investigation was uneven from the start. The Durst name carried influence. Their lawyers handled contact with investigators. Key records went missing, including information about Kathy's medical school calls the night she vanished. Detectives later admitted they lacked the resources and pushed to challenge someone of Robert's standing. Meanwhile, Susan Berman stepped in. By then, she had moved to Los Angeles to pursue writing. But when the story broke, she contacted Robert immediately. To her, the media appeared eager to portray him as guilty before any evidence surfaced. She wrote statements defending him and managed calls from journalists. In the New York Times and other outlets, Susan's voice emerged as the one loyal defender, a friend insisting on his innocence. To some reporters, she sounded rehearsed, almost protective to the point of denial. Privately, Robert distanced himself further from scrutiny. He refused to participate in repeated police interviews and later admitted to lying about certain details, like the final phone call from Kathy. His explanations shifted across decades. Sometimes he said he wasn't sure what happened. Other times, he insisted Kathy had run off to be with someone else. But investigators and her family could never find proof of that. Her accounts were frozen. A medical uniform left in the Hamptons house, personal items untouched, bank accounts unspent. The emotional fallout from Kathy's disappearance split communities, and the Durst family itself. Douglas and other relatives wanted to protect the business by minimizing attention, while some family friends believed Robert had done something terrible. He inherited large sums but lived more like a recluse. Over the years, he bought modest apartments under aliases, grew increasingly paranoid, and avoided all public appearances. Susan, meanwhile, continued to believe, or at least to say she believed, in his innocence. The two stayed in sporadic contact. When journalists circled too close, Robert would call her for advice. She always answered. They shared something that looked like loyalty, but often felt like codependence. Susan's friends later said she couldn't separate her fierce protectiveness from her need to belong. Robert's behavior in the 1990s grew more erratic. Within the family, legal battles intensified as Douglas officially took control of the company. Robert sued, claiming he had been mistreated and cheated of his inheritance. The fight dragged on for years, turning every family gathering into a standoff. Around that time, with mounting tension and renewed media curiosity about Kathy's disappearance, Robert began severing ties with almost everyone except Susan. To understand their bond, you have to see what each represented to the other. Robert saw in Susan the rare person who didn't flinch at scandal, someone comfortable with secrets. For Susan, Robert was her link to the high society she had always craved but never fully joined. They enabled each other's mythologies. He, the misunderstood heir; she, the insider confidant. In 1999, a new push to reopen the Kathy Durst case began. Detectives in Westchester County started reviewing old evidence. Kathy's friends had kept up pressure for nearly 2 decades. They now urged authorities to treat Robert as a homicide suspect, not just a missing persons contact. Investigators traced every witness, every record they could. Among those they planned to interview was Susan Berman. She wasn't considered a potential suspect, but rather someone who might finally tell what she knew. Rumors swirled that back in 1982, after Kathy's disappearance, Robert had gone to Susan's home in Los Angeles, distraught, and possibly confessed. Some versions claimed she had helped him craft his public response, or even provided cover for him by pretending to be Kathy on a phone call to a medical school dean. That detail, whether she made that call, became a crucial question decades later. When Susan heard that investigators wanted to speak with her, she didn't seem afraid at first. According to close friends, she joked about it but hinted she felt protective of Robert. She told one friend she would never say anything that would hurt Bob. Yet those same friends said she was broke, waiting for a check he promised to send, money to catch up on bills and rent. Whether Robert sent that money or not remains unclear, but phone records showed they were still in contact. The renewed attention to Kathy's disappearance put Robert under pressure again. Newly assigned detectives tracked his history meticulously and looked for inconsistencies in his stories. They also examined his properties and connections. For the first time in years, a real sense of pursuit resumed. Reporters began asking questions not only about Kathy, but about the mysterious loyalty of his old friend Susan. Susan moved through those weeks with the mixed energy of someone trying to appear calm while under pressure. She worked on her writings, cared for her dog, and chatted with friends, but her finances were strained, and her mood shifted quickly. Several people recalled that she mentioned Robert's support repeatedly, as though reassuring herself more than others. In December 2000, as investigators prepared to travel to Los Angeles to interview her, Susan Berman's life ended with a single gunshot. For years afterward, the question lingered. Had she known too much? Or was it coincidence that danger found her just as detectives approached? The Durst family was silent at first. Robert issued no statement. When police identified him as a person of interest, he brushed it off as absurd. To him, Susan had been one of his closest friends. He said he had last spoken to her days before Christmas and hadn't heard anything since. Yet when detectives asked to see his handwriting for comparison with the anonymous cadaver note, he hesitated, hiring lawyers again. The tragedy of Kathy and Susan's stories intertwined completely after that. Neither woman would ever speak for herself again, but together they shaped the central mystery of Robert Durst's life, the line between accident, secrecy, and intent. The Kathy Durst disappearance cast such a long shadow that even decades later, when cameras followed Robert for the HBO series that would bring him down, he couldn't escape it. But in those early 2000 years, long before the spotlight returned, the story was still mostly whispered. Investigators in New York pieced through old files, trying to connect two worlds. the empty apartment in Manhattan in 1982, and the blood-stained floor in Los Angeles in 2000. What linked them, they believed, was a friendship forged in privilege and bound by silence. Susan Berman had been the one person outside New York's elite who truly knew Robert Durst. She understood his temper, his loneliness, and his lies. Yet she also shared his instinct for secrecy. The tragedy of their relationship wasn't only in how it ended, but in how completely it reflected the world around them. A world where money insulated truth, and where loyalty, once weaponized, became deadly. The Durst dynasty that once dictated Manhattan's skyline had raised sons to believe they could control everything: property, people, even the narrative of a woman's disappearance. But in the quiet of Susan Berman's Benedict Canyon home, all that control finally fractured. The empire's shadow had followed Robert to California, and history, once buried under wealth and denial, was about to surface. Long before her name was connected to murder investigations or to Robert Durst, Susan Jane Berman carried another kind of notoriety. She had been born into the underworld's royalty. Her father, Davy Berman, was not just a casino owner. He was one of the men who helped build Las Vegas when it was still a desert frontier of neon promises and criminal opportunity. To many, he was a businessman. To those who knew better, he was part of the same syndicate that included Bugsy Siegel and Meyer Lansky. At home, the tension between glamour and violence was ordinary life. Susan grew up in privilege, surrounded by servants and chauffeurs, silk dresses and mansions that doubled as fortress-like compounds. Yet childhood in the Berman household never felt secure. Her father's fortune came from gambling profits that depended on loyalty and fear. Her mother, Gladys, lived with anxiety that came from knowing everything could fall apart overnight. Susan would later write that the household doors were always locked, that telephones seemed to carry more secrets than conversation. Guests were charming but watched. Every smile, she learned, could hide an agenda. When she was still a little girl, she attended private schools, where she was both admired and shunned. Teachers complimented her good manners. Classmates whispered that her father was a gangster. She resented it, but also drew power from it. When other children boasted of movie star parents, Susan quietly knew her father's associates could buy or ruin those stars with a single phone call. That contradiction, fear mixed with pride, became central to her identity. Davy Berman tried to shield his daughter from the darker side of the operation. Still, she heard fragments, hushed discussions about collections, meetings in back rooms, the tension when certain names were mentioned. She adored him, but she also saw the weight he carried. In 1957, when Susan was still in her teens, Davy Berman died unexpectedly after surgery. The death left the family rudderless. Gladys sank into depression and died a few years later. In the space of 1 decade, Susan lost both parents and most of the stability she had known. The inheritance looked substantial but dwindled quickly. Lawyers handled dubious property claims. Old friends reappeared requesting favors or loans. By her early 20s, Susan had money problems. She didn't entirely understand debts, unpaid taxes, and rights battles over her father's estate. The safety net of mob protection had vanished. What lingered was reputation. Wherever she went, people identified her as the mobster's daughter. Some were intrigued, others cautious. The paradox fascinated her. At the University of California, Los Angeles, Susan reinvented herself. UCLA in the 1960s was alive with energy, with film students experimenting with handheld cameras, writers drawing from Beat Generation realism, and actors dreaming of stardom. Susan fit right in. She majored in journalism and theatre arts, mixing her love of performance with curiosity about human motives. Friends remembered her as witty, dramatic, and always performing, even when no one asked for it. She wore vintage clothes, quoted Chandler novels, and spoke with the quick rhythm of someone used to commanding attention. Although her money troubles followed her, she managed to live like a socialite, hosting informal salons in cheap apartments full of second-hand furniture and jazz records. In that orbit, she met people who would connect her to the larger circles of Los Angeles: writers, filmmakers, and students with East Coast backgrounds. Among them was a quiet young man from New York, identified simply as Bob Durst. Their bond formed through shared oddness. Susan found his discomfort around others endearing. He, in turn, was drawn to her absolute lack of embarrassment about lineage. He told her she made him feel normal. Outside of friendships, Susan pursued writing relentlessly. In the early 1970s, she worked as a reporter, eventually contributing to local magazines. Her style blended gossip and self-analysis, and editors noticed that behind her humor lay sadness. She once wrote that truth is often the scariest performance. That theme grew into her later work. By her mid-30s, she began drafting a memoir about her upbringing in Las Vegas. It would later be published under the title Easy Street. Easy Street offered America a rare insider's account of organized crime from the perspective of a daughter, not an enforcer. In crisp, cinematic chapters, she described casino corridors, whispered deals, and the loneliness of being loved by a man feared by everyone else. Critics praised its candor and sharp voice. It gave Susan brief literary attention and the chance to appear on television talk shows, where she charmed hosts with self-deprecating wit. But behind the success was a deeper ache. Writing about her father reopened every wound she had tried to bury. Money from the book didn't last. Agents promised film adaptations that never materialized. She took ghostwriting jobs for celebrities who wanted edgy memoirs, but preferred anonymity. Each project paid enough to cover rent, never more. She adopted a dog named Chica and treated it as family. Her social circle grew into an eclectic mix of Hollywood B-listers, former journalists, and aging musicians who adored her stories. Yet despite constant company, she admitted feeling lonely. Friends said she often spoke of her parents as if they had died only months earlier. By the 1990s, Susan lived in a small house on Benedict Canyon Drive, a shadow of the luxury she once knew but still holding touches of performer flair. Leopard print couches, stacks of vintage Vogue, and the lingering smell of lacquered hair products. Visitors described her home as half-glamorous relic, half-struggling artist's retreat. The contrast between fantasy and instability defined her. Bills piled up on the kitchen counter, yet she would host guests with champagne someone else bought. Her writing career staggered. She pitched television pilots, one loosely inspired by mob daughters navigating Hollywood. Networks passed. She wrote essays about loneliness and loyalty, always circling back to whether love could outweigh truth. When meetings failed, she shifted tone, telling friends she was gathering material for later. The humor never fully disguised desperation. Through it all, she remained fiercely possessive of old friendships. Robert Durst was the one consistent presence. He mailed her checks occasionally, helped with small debts, and called sporadically. Over the years, she read his letters the way others might read tarot cards, looking for hidden affection, reassurance that despite fame and scandal, someone still needed her counsel. She once called him the brother who never abandoned me. Susan's loyalty was not blind, it was emotional accounting. Having lost her parents early, she clung to stories that let her control chaos. Durst, secretive and erratic, provided endless mystery. She could comfort and interpret him, filling her own narrative of worth. That instinct for storytelling, born in the neon haze of Vegas, became survival behavior. Whenever her own career floundered, she converted personal turmoil into plotlines. People who met her late in life commented that she lived as if camera crews might appear at any moment. She would strike poses, recount scandal, and then retreat into silence. She spoke of developing a screenplay about her father's generation, but feared legal repercussions from still living associates. She reminded friends that mob memory never dies. Even decades after her father's death, she received occasional phone calls from unknown numbers. Sometimes there was only static. She brushed them off, but never stopped checking the locks at night. Her humor masked paranoia that she inherited from childhood. One moment she would declare she feared nothing. The next, she would whisper that her phone was tapped. Hollywood acquaintances wrote this off as eccentricity, yet it revealed how the daughter of a gangster could never truly escape inherited vigilance. The world taught her that safety depended on which secrets you kept and for whom. That psychology bled into every relationship. She trusted people who displayed danger, and distrusted those who seemed too kind. When police officers or landlords visited, she over-explained ordinary things, eager to appear cooperative, yet terrified of mistakes. Friends said she wanted to be seen as strong but constantly feared being misunderstood. Her writing notebooks were full of reminders to tell my side someday. By the time she reached 55, Susan's life resembled one long monologue of highs and lows. Some mornings she would talk excitedly about potential projects. By evening she would weep over unpaid bills. She maintained an answering machine greeting that mixed professionalism with whimsy, hoping it might impress a producer calling. She still dreamed of being rediscovered. Looking back, Susan's transformation from mob daughter to striving Hollywood writer captured the contradictions of 20th century America. Reinvention, alongside inherited risk. She grew up surrounded by men who believed control could rewrite fate, then spent adulthood proving stories could too. The very skills that helped her survive charm, secrecy, performance, would later place her in proximity to a man whose secrets were lethal. When she spoke of loyalty, she meant something absolute. In one recorded interview from the 1980s, she said, "I'm a Berman, we stand by our people." It sounded like pride at the time, but as the new millennium approached, that creed would turn into tragedy. The ghost of the mob world had taught her one rule: those who know the story behind the story must know when to stay silent. In December 2000, silence found her. Long before investigators pieced together connections or handwriting analysis, her past had already written the script. The daughter of the mob who had tried to live by words would become a victim of the same unspoken code she once admired. The code of secrets, kept far too long. Late December in Los Angeles rarely feels like winter. The hills stay green, the air warm, and the city hums with last-minute holiday errands. For Susan Berman, the season brought a flicker of hope. She had mailed Christmas cards, wrapped small gifts for friends, and planned to spend Christmas Eve quietly with her dog, Chica. On December 23rd, she spoke with a neighbor and seemed upbeat. No one knew those would be her final hours. Sometime that weekend, someone she trusted knocked on her front door. No sign of forced entry was ever found. The locks remained intact, windows unbroken, alarm system undisturbed. Whoever came to visit had been welcomed inside. Investigators later determined that Susan was shot once in the back of the head, automatic pistol pressed close to her skull. There was little blood spatter, suggesting she never saw the gun, and her body fell forward onto the carpet of her small den. Days passed before anyone realized she was gone. Mail accumulated at the gate. Friends who called heard only the familiar answering machine greeting, cheerful and professional, "This is Susan. Leave me a message and I'll get back to you." By December 24th, that machine was still running, even though the house behind it had gone silent. That morning, one friend grew worried. Susan never missed scheduled meetings, especially when expecting a payment. After repeated calls, he drove over to check. Chica barked from behind the door but did not sound distressed. When no one answered, he contacted police, requesting a welfare check. Officers from the Los Angeles Police Department arrived before noon. As they entered through the unlocked rear door, the dog ran toward them and then back into the living room, as if leading the way. There, on the floor by the bookshelf, lay Susan Berman, lifeless. The first responders believed it might be a suicide until they saw blood matted in her hairline, too small for a close-range misfire, precise, like an execution. Detectives sealed the scene immediately. Nothing appeared stolen. Christmas gifts waited unwrapped beneath a small artificial tree. The kitchen counter held one unopened envelope addressed to her, and a half-finished mug of coffee had gone cold. Hours later, 20 miles away, at the Beverly Hills Police Department, an envelope arrived in the mailroom. It contained a single sheet of paper. Across the top, in neat printing, with a black felt-tip pen, someone had written, "Cadaver." Below it, Beverly Hills. The return address space was blank. Postal marks suggested it had been sent the morning of December 23rd. Investigators looked at it with confusion. The note seemed both crude and purposeful. Why warn the police about a body instead of fleeing quietly? And why misspell Beverly, writing it as Beverly? Forensic experts found the choice of words unusual. Criminals rarely use the term cadaver. Law enforcement and medical professionals do. Whoever wrote it wanted the body found, but not necessarily themselves identified. The envelope provided their first physical clue: the handwriting. Block letters. Slight right tilt. Consistent spacing. Detectives began with the basics. No fingerprints on the letter. No DNA on the stamp. The ink came from a commonly sold marker. They focused on Susan's life. Interviews with neighbors painted a picture of a friendly but eccentric woman who loved her dog and her books. She had visitors often yet none around the holidays. Several noted one peculiar thing. A few days prior, they had seen a shabby-looking sedan parked outside. One neighbor thought a thin, older man had been sitting inside, reading a newspaper. Police traced Susan's recent communications. Phone records showed conversations with friends in New York, agents in California, and one with Robert Durst dated around December 19th. Investigators did not know his significance yet. At that time, Durst was living primarily on the East Coast and occasionally in Texas. When questioned later, he confirmed they had spoken, but claimed he had last seen her a couple years earlier. He said the call was about a check he promised to send, not unusual given their friendship. The autopsy confirmed a single gunshot wound from behind. No defensive injuries, no trace of struggle. Time of death estimated late on December 23rd. Toxicology suggested no drugs or alcohol. It was a clean, deliberate act. Detectives theorized that the killer had personal access, entered calmly, shot her swiftly, and left by foot or car within minutes, Reporters arrived fast, once word spread. A writer with mob roots slain in her own home, Hollywood could not resist. Early articles highlighted her family's ties to Las Vegas crime syndicates, proposing revenge theories. Some speculated unpaid debts, others manuscript disputes. Police entertained every angle, but no evidence linked her to current criminal networks. Over time, public interest faded. Without fresh leads, the file gathered dust among hundreds of open cases labeled unsolved, probable acquaintance homicide. While the investigation in Los Angeles stagnated, subtle ripples spread elsewhere. Detectives in Westchester County, New York, the same unit reviewing Kathy Durst's disappearance, were startled when they heard that Susan Berman had been killed. She was on their interview list as a potential witness, scheduled to meet them just after Christmas. That coincidence pushed suspicion toward Robert Durst almost immediately. They contacted the Los Angeles Police Department to share information, highlighting the connection. 2 jurisdictions, however, meant procedural delays. Without direct evidence placing Durst in California at the time, no warrant could issue. Airline and credit records showed nothing unusual. Still, seasoned investigators noticed parallels: the timing of her murder, the anonymous note to police, and the fact that she had protected Durst for years. Friends of Susan provided statements that deepened the intrigue. Several recalled her describing an upcoming meeting with detectives about Kathy. One said, "She felt torn. She told me, 'I have to be honest, but I won't betray Bob.'" Another remembered her relief when she received money in the mail, assuming it came from him. That check, dated mid-December, cleared just before she died. The clue that haunted investigators most was the note. Comparing it to samples of Robert Durst's handwriting would take years, but even in 2000, the odd misspelling caught attention. Beverly Hills was not something a local would write. It suggested an outsider or someone unfamiliar with the area, fitting a man primarily based in New York or Texas. Despite these hints, no arrest followed. Robert Durst publicly denied involvement and cooperated minimally. He attended Susan's memorial in Las Vegas through representation rather than in person, citing travel constraints. His aloofness struck some friends as cold, others as self-protection. Detectives re-examined Susan's last days in detail. Bank records showed no large withdrawals. Her answering machine contained half a dozen messages from acquaintances, all mundane. One, recorded December 22nd, included a male voice, soft, monotone, possibly East Coast accent, thanking her for a letter. The quality was too poor for positive identification. Police preserved the tape, unsure it meant anything. Months slipped into years. The Berman case languished, overshadowed by newer investigations. Her house, after forensic release, was cleared and sold. Belongings went to storage. Only Chica remained alive, later adopted by one of Susan's friends. Within the precinct archives, the notation, "awaiting further leads," became a formality. But Los Angeles homicide detectives never entirely closed the file. Some continued comparing the Berman case to patterns involving execution-style shootings linked to personal betrayals. In those analyses, motive often rested on silencing someone who knew too much, and by then, talk had resurfaced that Susan might have impersonated Kathy Durst during the 1982 cover story call to the medical school dean, an act that could expose Robert Durst if ever confirmed. By 2001, the story twisted again. News broke from Texas that Robert Durst had been arrested after the dismembered body of his neighbor, Morris Black, was discovered in Galveston Bay. Suddenly, detectives in 3 states, New York, Texas, and California, found themselves comparing notes about one man connected to 3 violent deaths. Susan's once-forgotten murder case regained priority. If prosecutors could prove that Durst killed her to prevent cooperation with police, they might finally close the circle, beginning with Kathy's disappearance. During renewed analysis, the cadaver note returned as central evidence. Handwriting experts compared it to Durst's letters from the 1980s and drafts from financial documents. Similarities emerged in the formation of letters A and V and the spacing of capitalized words. Still, without a direct confession or witness, it was not enough for indictment. For Susan's Los Angeles friends, closure never came. Her memorial service at Temple Beth Israel drew former journalists, screenwriters, and college acquaintances who remembered her talent for turning pain into performance. One friend said through tears, "Susan lived her life like a story she was always rewriting, until someone else wrote the ending for her." Himself, privately, even those who had adored her admitted she had been frightened before her death. She had spoken about investigators calling from New York and about knowing things she wished she did not. The words that once earned laughs "I'm a Berman, we keep secrets," sounded tragic in retrospect. As for Robert Durst, the murder of his longtime confidant marked the start of his unraveling. Every examination of his later life circles back to that December weekend when a friendship wrapped in decades of complicity turned fatal. The silence of Susan Berman's Benedict Canyon home would outlast the echoes of the gunshot, traveling through courtrooms, documentaries, and confession tapes years later. In the end, what the Beverly Hills note announced was not just a body. It announced the beginning of the end for the man who wrote it. But in December 2000, investigators did not yet know that. They only knew a woman lay dead, her dog still waiting. Her story paused mid-sentence, while the friend she trusted most was again out of reach. When detectives in Los Angeles were still puzzling over the cadaver note, Robert Durst had already vanished from his familiar world. It was not unusual for him to slip away after media flare-ups, but this disappearance felt different. In early 2001, he quietly sold off furniture, disconnected his phones, and left behind apartments in both New York and New Jersey. Friends assumed he was traveling abroad. In reality, the millionaire heir was heading to Texas, seeking total anonymity. He chose Galveston, a windswept island city on the Gulf Coast, equal parts fishing port and faded resort town. It was the kind of place where outsiders could blend in if they kept to themselves. Durst rented a small, cluttered apartment inside a weather-beaten boarding house on Avenue K. The locals knew the property as one of those half-decayed buildings where retirees, students, and drifters paid cash weekly. He moved in under the alias Dorothy Cena, borrowing the surname from a former college acquaintance. To make the disguise believable, he bought a cheap wig, pasted on adhesive sideburns, and began presenting himself as a mute woman. To anyone paying brief attention, he looked eccentric but harmless, a stooped figure in dated dresses, padding around town with grocery bags. When the landlord introduced Dorothy, the tenant shrugged. Galveston had its share of characters. Durst, now in his late 50s, spent most days holed up watching TV and reading. He occasionally shopped at the local hardware store, paying in small bills, never chatting long enough to invite familiarity. But not everyone in the building ignored him. Across the hall lived a 71-year-old man named Morris Black. Unlike most neighbors, Morris was not interested in small talk either. He was retired, hard-headed, and famously irritable. Longtime locals knew him as the guy who argued over fishing rights at the pier, and once chased a landlord down the hallway with a broom. He had come to Galveston years earlier after losing work up north, surviving on savings and Social Security. Behind the gruff exterior was intelligence. He read newspapers cover to cover and quoted political statistics like a talk radio host. The two misfits, one a lonely drifter hiding under a female alias, the other a cranky retiree on the margins, found a strange rhythm. They met through the building's back porch, where residents dumped scrap wood for small repairs. Durst, under the guise of Dorothy, nodded politely. Morris nodded back. Soon, Morris began dropping by, unannounced. He would ask this quiet lady if she needed help lifting boxes, then linger for beer. Within weeks, the pair were sharing meals and watching television together. Durst later admitted dropping the act in private, telling Morris he was actually a man hiding from family problems. Neighbors observed the odd friendship, the mismatched duo buying groceries together, driving to rummage sales, even feeding stray cats along the seawall. Most took it as a companionship between two loners, but tension brewed beneath. Morris was notoriously nosy. He asked too many questions about Durst's finances and why someone apparently wealthy chose to live among transient tenants. He peeked into that cluttered apartment, noticing cash bundles on the table. During one conversation, according to Durst's later statement, Morris became fixated on learning about the real reason Dorothy was hiding. Those questions would, he claimed, spark the violence that followed. On September 28, 2001, a local teenager boating on the bay spotted a black trash bag floating near the marina. Inside were human body parts, cleanly cut but incomplete. Within hours, more bags washed ashore, arms, legs, and a torso. The head was missing. Galveston police sealed the scene and sent divers into the murky water. From fingerprints on one hand, they identified the victim, Morris Black, tenant of 221 Avenue K. Officers hurried to the boarding house, expecting a gruesome discovery. They found his unit streaked with blood and soaked towels stuffed under the sink. In the adjoining apartment, rented to Dorothy Cena, they found a saw, knives, and newspaper sheets coated with dried residue. But the tenant herself was gone. Within 24 hours, the truth reached them. Dorothy Sinner was actually Robert Durst, a name that sent ripples through Texas law enforcement, once connected to missing person files from New York and the unsolved Los Angeles murder of Susan Berman. What at first looked like a local horror now carried national weight. An intensive manhunt followed. Detectives canvassed bus stations and small airports, tracing receipts. 3 days later, Durst was spotted inside a supermarket near Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. He had walked in wearing a baseball cap and glasses, calmly shoplifting a chicken sandwich and Band-Aids. Security stopped him, unaware they were detaining a fugitive millionaire. When police searched his rented car, they found $37,000 in cash, 2 pistols, a stack of fake IDs, and directions back to Galveston. Under arrest, Durst barely resisted. He told officers he was very tired. In his wallet was the New Jersey driver's license for Dorothy Sinner. In his trunk was a bow saw, compatible with the cuts on Morris Black's remains. It was the sort of evidence that should have guaranteed conviction for murder and abuse of a corpse. But nothing about Robert Durst ever moved straightforwardly. At his arraignment, he whispered that the killing had been self-defense. According to his account, Morris Black had discovered his true identity after finding a newspaper story about the still-missing Kathy Durst and the killing of Susan Berman. Black supposedly confronted him angrily, pointing a gun. A struggle ensued. The gun went off, killing Black. He claimed panic drove him to dismember the body, an act he called a mistake born of fear. Detectives found that nearly impossible to believe. The scene indicated careful cleaning, joints cut precisely, tools washed, and trash bags weighted for sinking. Still, absent eyewitnesses or the missing head that could prove trajectory, prosecutors faced challenges. All they could charge decisively were murder and evidence tampering, knowing the latter would be easier to prove. Then came the question of resources. Durst could afford elite defense attorneys, who immediately posted bail amounting to $300,000, pocket change to someone with inherited fortune. Surprisingly, he skipped bail almost instantly. In November 2001, while awaiting trial, he abandoned the Galveston area, driving east in a friend's car. For 6 weeks, he lived itinerantly across the United States, using cash reserves hidden in multiple bank envelopes. He shaved his head, grew a beard, and switched motels nightly. When finally recaptured in Pennsylvania, it was not through high-tech pursuit, but a single traffic stop. He failed to signal while driving a rental car. The arresting officer found marijuana, a weapon, and massive cash again. When reporters asked if he feared prison, Durst smiled slightly and said, "I have been in smaller places." Psychologists later described that detachment as symptomatic of deep disconnection. He treated each calamity like another scenario to analyze rather than feel. Back in Texas, the Galveston County courtroom became a media spectacle. The idea of a New York real estate heir accused of dismembering a neighbor in a shabby coastal town drew cameras from every network. The prosecution emphasized deliberate concealment and calculated flight. The defense, banking on Durst's wealth and odd charisma, painted Morris Black as a volatile old man who threatened him first. Over weeks of testimony, Durst himself took the stand, a move few expected. He described in chilling monotone how Morris had brandished the gun, how they wrestled, and how the weapon discharged. Every word was clinical, detached. He admitted to cutting up Black's body, not out of hatred, he said, but from panic that police would never believe his story because of his wife's disappearance. He repeated that phrase often. They would never believe me. Jurors watched hours of bloody photographs and video from the bay. Yet the headless nature of the remains left lingering doubt about bullet trajectory. Without that, self-defense could not be ruled out. The defense hammered at the gap. Tragic, yes, but the state cannot prove murder beyond a reasonable doubt. When deliberations ended on November 11th, 2003, the verdict stunned the room. Robert Durst was acquitted of murder. He was convicted only of tampering with evidence for dismembering the corpse, a charge carrying a maximum 5-year term. With time already served and good behavior, he walked free within months. A millionaire who admitted cutting up his neighbor had technically beaten a murder rap. Public opinion split. Some saw a grotesque miscarriage of justice bought by money. Others saw a bizarre but plausible story, a recluse defending himself from an unstable neighbor. Even those who despised the outcome could not ignore Durst's cold intellect on the stand. He never once raised his voice, explaining dismemberment like household maintenance. When asked why he scattered the body, he simply noted, "I wanted to make it hard to identify." That calm phrasing echoed across America. Talk shows replayed the quote, audiences alternating between disbelief and morbid fascination. True crime columnists speculated about sociopathy. What kind of mind could confess to such acts without visible emotion? Meanwhile, detectives in New York and Los Angeles quietly revisited their dormant files. The acquittal meant Durst could not be retried for Morris Black, but it reminded everyone how unpredictable he was and how dangerous silence around him could become. During interviews after release, Durst rented modest apartments, drifting between states. He occasionally phoned acquaintances, collecting mail at old addresses. To casual contact, he sounded polite, even amused by the media circus. He told one reporter, "People think I'm hiding, I'm just living." Yet that living looked more like calculated invisibility. He stayed in cheap motels despite having millions locked in trusts. He carried no phone. The disguise changed, from wig to baseball cap, but the impulse remained: vanish before questions arrive. Psychological evaluations later noted that Durst appeared to crave proximity to exposure, yet trusted only isolation. Galveston gave him both. For nearly a year, he inhabited a caricature of anonymity, millionaire pretending poverty, speaking to no one, imagining himself invisible. In that state, killing Morris Black might have represented a loss of control more than a plot. The moment his neighbor pierced the secrecy bubble, the story turned violent. And once blood spilled, the man groomed for empire defaulted to the same learned strategy that had shielded him his entire life. Clean up, leave town, start new. Legal scholars still debate what allowed the acquittal, a skilled defense or flawed forensics. Either way, Durst walked away convinced of his own invulnerability. The precedent reinforced a pattern. Every investigation around him ended not with accountability, but with escape. When Texas freed him, he celebrated quietly at a diner, paying in cash, tipping heavily, then driving off in a rental car heading west. That single journey would tie 3 crime scenes together. For the Los Angeles detectives nursing Susan Berman's unsolved file, the Galveston case was a wake-up call. Here was the same man they suspected of killing their victim, now exposed through another bizarre death. They began collaborating with handwriting experts to compare the cadaver note to Durst's letters, confiscated in Texas. The resemblance startled them. The misspellings, the clean block letters, the same methodical spacing. But mid-2000s, science lacked the digital precision later used in court, so they labelled the match probable, not definitive. The evidence sat waiting for the right catalyst. Meanwhile, Durst's freedom brought him back, paradoxically, closer to cameras. Producers who had followed his trials approached with documentary ideas. He toyed with proposals, offering cryptic remarks: "I might as well tell my own story before someone else does." He understood the performance of narrative, perhaps as deeply as Susan Berman had. 2 storytellers, one gone, the other unrepentant. In retrospect, the Morris Black interlude occupies a bizarre middle chapter in Durst's life, a grotesque rehearsal for exposure. It demonstrated how far he had gone to erase connections and how skilled he was at manipulating procedure. It also revealed something prosecutors later exploited: his need to explain himself. Despite layers of deception, Durst eventually sought listeners. When none remained among family or friends, cameras would do. That hunger for narrative, the same impulse that drew media to his crimes, would, years later, betray him. The Gulf wind that carried those plastic bags ashore effectively reopened every secret Durst had tried to sink. From that moment, lines connected. Kathy's vanishing in 1982, Susan Berman's execution in 2000, Morris Black's dismemberment in 2001. Each incident spoke to a man driven equally by control and carelessness, able to plan meticulously yet capable of catastrophic error. Every escape emboldened him further, leading eventually to microphones, hot mics, and a whispered admission that would echo around the world. For now, in the early 2000s, the world simply stared at the contradiction: an elderly millionaire cross-dressing murderer, free on bail, wandering diners, smiling faintly when recognized. Galveston's locals joked darkly about our weird Yankee neighbor. They did not know he was only pausing before the final unwinding of his legend. The Morris Black episode was never just a bizarre detour. It was the hinge between secrecy and spectacle, a grim intermission before justice finally began to catch up. By the early 20-teens, the Susan Berman murder had officially become a cold case. Files sat boxed in Los Angeles police storage, digital copies filed under unresolved homicides, but one detective, a veteran named Paul Coulter, could not let it go. He had grown up in the city and remembered the case for its strangeness, the anonymous note, the mob background, and that New York connection few could explain. When media stories revived Robert Durst's name in connection with renewed interest in his first wife's disappearance, Coulter reopened the folder. What drew him back was not a new tip. It was handwriting. Over the years, Various journalists had obtained copies of letters Robert Durst sent to Susan Berman. Most were friendly, short notes about money or holiday greetings. When Coulter compared one of those envelopes to the cadaver note from 2000, something clicked. Both used block letters. Both spelled Beverly wrong. The resemblance looked uncanny. He sent samples to the department's forensic lab and quietly circulated them among outside handwriting experts. Early opinions were cautious but consistent. The same writer probably produced both. That single detail reignited the case. Coulter coordinated with prosecutors who still followed the Kathy Durst investigation in New York. They, too, had long suspected a connection between the deaths of Kathy and Susan. If they could prove Susan's murder served to silence her before she cooperated, it could strengthen both cases. They needed evidence that went beyond speculation, something a jury could touch. At the same time, public interest in Durst's story was growing again. A new generation of true crime journalists rediscovered him, a wealthy, eccentric man tied to 3 deaths, but never truly punished. Documentary filmmakers Andrew Jarecki and Mark Smerling approached Durst for a project exploring his wife's disappearance. To everyone's surprise, he agreed. He seemed eager to talk, perhaps believing he could outsmart or control whatever narrative unfolded. Production on what would eventually become HBO's The Jinx started quietly. Durst sat for interviews over several years, recounting his childhood, his mother's death, and his relationships. He spoke openly about Susan Berman, calling her a loyal friend, even a sister figure. He smiled while describing their college days at UCLA, how she had looked after him, but when asked about her death, he grew guarded. The filmmakers noticed his gaze drift whenever the subject arose. Behind the scenes, the directors received boxes of documents from Durst's lawyers, old letters, photos, and legal records. Among them was a folded envelope Susan had saved from the 1990s, addressed in Durst's blocky print. When editor Zach Stewart-Pontier placed that envelope beside a scanned image of the cadaver note, the match jumped off the screen. Same handwriting, same slanted capital N, same printing spacing, and again, the same misspelling of Beverly. The team understood the potential magnitude but proceeded cautiously. They contacted handwriting experts to conduct blind comparisons without identifying the source. The results were startlingly consistent. It appeared the author of the note warning police to Susan Berman's body and the author of letters known to be from Durst were one and the same. This discovery turned a documentary into evidence gathering. Meanwhile, prosecutors who had stayed skeptical for decades suddenly had something tangible. The filmmakers shared their findings with law enforcement, who commissioned independent forensic reviews. Each confirmed what intuition had whispered for years. For investigators, the key question shifted from, did he do it, to how do we prove it in court? As the filmmakers continued filming, Durst's erratic nature deepened. He would call the crew late at night, demanding extra sessions or recounting strange anecdotes. In one message, he said, "I know what they're all saying, but they cannot prove anything." He sometimes seemed half-flattered by his own myth, yet his trust in the documentary's creators bordered on blind. That trust would undo him. The production climaxed in what later became one of true crime television's most chilling moments. After a tense interview session during which Jarecki confronted him with writing comparisons, Durst slipped into the restroom, still wearing a live microphone. Whispering to himself, he muttered, "There it is. You're caught. What the hell did I do? Killed them all, of course." It was not a confession sworn under oath, but context gave it devastating force. Viewers who later saw The Jinx were transfixed. For police and prosecutors, it was the spark needed to push for formal charges. Before airing the series, the filmmakers alerted authorities to what they had captured. Investigators rushed to verify the words and confirm chain of custody. The audio alone could not convict, but combined with the handwriting evidence, it painted an unmistakable picture. Robert Durst had both motive and opportunity. He had sent Susan money days before her death, spoken with her by phone, and faced renewed scrutiny from New York detectives she had planned to meet. By 2015, Los Angeles County's Cold Case Unit and the District Attorney's Office assembled enough material for an arrest warrant. It listed first-degree murder with special circumstances, killing a witness. Detectives tracked Durst, then 71, to a hotel in New Orleans, where he registered under another alias. When officers moved in, they found a revolver, a latex mask, more fake IDs, and over $40,000 cash in his possession. Once again, flight suggested consciousness of guilt. News of the arrest broke just before the Jinx finale aired. Viewers who had watched years of speculation suddenly saw reality unfold in real time. The man at the center of a decades-long mystery was finally in custody. Durst was extradited to Los Angeles to stand trial for Susan Berman's murder. Pre-trial proceedings exposed layers of his history. Prosecutors argued that Robert Durst feared Susan might reveal she had helped him fabricate an alibi for Kathy's disappearance, specifically by posing as Kathy in that notorious phone call to the medical school. If she broke silence, the old missing persons case could transform into homicide. Killing her, they said, was the ultimate act of control. Defense lawyers countered with the argument familiar from Galveston: coincidence, not conspiracy. They claimed the prosecution had no hard forensic evidence, no weapon recovered, no eyewitness, only circumstantial handwriting analysis and ambiguous statements from a manicured recording session. But jurors would later say what kept echoing in their minds was not just ink or words. It was pattern. Decades of disappearance and death surrounding one man. The renewed investigation uncovered forgotten fragments. DNA testing of the Beverly Hills envelope turned up partial profiles, too degraded for certainty, but sufficient to exclude random suspects. Travel records placed Durst in Northern California just before Berman's murder, not far from Los Angeles. Bank logs confirmed a wire transfer of $25,000 to her account days before December 23rd. Individually, each piece might explain itself. Collectively, they traced intent. In 2020, after pandemic delays, the courtroom finally convened. Witnesses included former Galveston neighbors, handwriting experts, and decades-old friends of Susan Berman who remembered her anxiety before police questioning. Prosecutors replayed the now infamous bathroom audio from The Jinx. Though Durst's defense argued editing distortions, jurors heard enough unscripted phrases to infer self-recognition. Killed them all, of course, followed by, "What a disaster." Chills ran through the courtroom each time it played. It was during those sessions that new evidence surfaced publicly for the first time. Enhanced handwriting scans demonstrated near-perfect match scores on 21 distinct letter formations between the cadaver note and Durst's 1999 letter to Berman. Analysts said the probability of two individuals producing identical matches by coincidence was less than 1 in 6 million. Even Durst's lawyers stopped short of denying authorship. Instead, they reframed its meaning, arguing he had written it only after discovering her dead, not before. That claim raised more doubts than it solved. If he truly found her body and anonymously alerted police, why flee? Why lie about travel? Why never come forward later? Prosecutors called it yet another manufactured story in a lifetime of manufactured stories. The phrase resonated, capturing the pattern investigators had chased since 1982, lies rearranged to postpone consequence. During closing arguments, the district attorney projected side-by-side images of Susan and Kathy Durst. Two women, he said. Each trusted him. Each disappeared from her own future. The courtroom fell silent. Photos of Susan's Benedict Canyon house appeared next. Stacks of unopened mail. The small Christmas tree beside where she fell. Jurors watched in heavy silence, weighing what decades of secrecy had cost. While deliberations stretched over 3 days, reporters camped outside. On September 17th, 2021, the verdict arrived. Robert Durst was found guilty of first-degree murder. The conviction closed a 21-year mystery and, indirectly, reopened the story of Kathy Durst for one final re-evaluation. The announcement reached Susan Berman's surviving friends through whispered phone calls. Some wept, others just sat stunned. One longtime companion said, she would have loved to see the truth come out. Maybe not like this, but finally. When asked how it felt seeing his old friend's story, now defined by criminal cases and documentaries, another writer replied softly, she was always writing about fathers and loyalty. She just never realized loyalty could get you killed. In the weeks that followed, attention turned briefly toward what Durst might reveal about Kathy's fate. But age and illness caught up. Within months, he tested positive for infection while in custody. On January 10th, 2022, he died in hospital custody at 78. The chain of secrecy that had stretched 4 decades ended not with a confession but with silence. For investigators like Coulter, the case symbolized every frustration and reward of cold case work, how one envelope, one misspelled word, could bridge 20 years. For audiences of The Jinx, it demonstrated that storytelling itself can renew justice. A documentary meant to entertain became a piece of evidence. And for those who still visit Susan Berman's grave in Las Vegas, the epitaph engraved on stone carries a quiet irony. Writer and friend, both titles fit, both cost her everything. When the first episode of The Jinx The Life and Deaths of Robert Durst, aired on HBO in February 2015, many viewers did not realize they were watching the gradual collapse of a man who had spent 40 years outrunning consequence. For investigators, prosecutors, and families of the victims, it felt like history being replayed in public, every lie revisited, every unanswered question amplified by television. For Robert Durst himself, it was exposure disguised as self-expression. He believed that by telling his own story, he could control how it ended. Instead, the camera became the mirror that finally trapped him. The project had begun years earlier. Filmmaker Andrew Jarecki had already explored the Durst saga through a scripted movie called All Good Things, released in 2011. That film, loosely dramatizing the disappearance of Kathy Durst, reignited national curiosity about the reclusive heir. To Jarecki's shock, after the movie premiered, Robert Durst contacted him directly. He had seen the portrayal, recognized himself in the character played by Ryan Gosling, and said he wanted to tell the real story. What seemed, on its face, like arrogance was actually consistent with Durst's long pattern. Whenever cornered, he moved closer to the spotlight. Initial meetings between Jarecki and Durst were tentative. The filmmaker expected refusal once legal topics arose, but Durst proved oddly open. He brought stacks of documents, court filings, letters to journalists, old family photos, and promised full cooperation if he could speak freely. The arrangement was unprecedented, a man suspected in 3 deaths granting journalists hours of on-camera interviews. Over the next decade, the filmmakers amassed more than 20 hours of conversation with him. Durst, small and frail in frame but sharp-tongued, sat before the camera with the composure of someone long accustomed to interrogation. He spoke of his mother's death as if it were a documentary subject, rather than childhood trauma. He recounted his marriage to Kathy with clinical detachment, noting disagreements as if logging business transactions. About Susan Berman, he grew sentimental, calling her my best friend. He smiled gently when describing college days and the loyalty she had shown him. But when Jarecki asked, "Do you think whoever killed Susan might have been trying to protect you?" Durst's face stiffened. "Why would anyone need to protect me?" he replied. Behind the scenes, producers noticed contradictions. Durst's timeline surrounding his travel in 2000 shifted subtly each time. Sometimes he claimed to have been in Northern California, other times New York. When confronted with banking records showing wire transfers to Susan that December, he shrugged. She needed help. I had money. That indifference fascinated the crew as much as it frustrated them. As production stretched on, the filmmakers hunted physical evidence that might illuminate his half-answers. They requested access to court archives in Texas and California, acquiring copies of letters Durst had sent to various people over decades. Among the batch was one envelope addressed to Susan Berman, postmarked March 1999. Its neat block print lettering matched the anonymous cadaver note that had haunted detectives for 15 years. The discovery stopped Jarecki's team cold. They placed both documents side by side. The spacing, the slanted S, the deliberate misspelling of Beverly, everything aligned. Unsure what to do, they consulted forensic document analysts without disclosing context. Handwriting experts returned near-identical conclusions. The 2 envelopes were highly likely written by the same individual. For Jarecki and his editor, Zach Stewart-Pontier, the revelation transformed the jinx from retrospective into potential evidence. They wrestled with ethical questions. Should filmmakers become participants in an active criminal case? Could they air material that might influence future prosecution? While those debates simmered, Durst continued granting access. At times he even phoned late at night, leaving long voicemails musing about memory and guilt. "You're in the people business," he told Jarecki during one call. "I'm in the people avoidance business." Behind that wry humour lurked anxiety. As he aged, his defences, both legal and psychological, began to fracture. He wanted acknowledgement more than secrecy, apology more than absolution. In later interviews, Durst's control slipped. Jarecki noticed he would sometimes answer unasked questions, preempting accusations that had not yet been spoken. During one session, the director mentioned the cadaver note, showing him the photocopy. Durst leaned forward, examining the letters. "Looks like the handwriting could be mine," he admitted slowly, "but I didn't write the note." The statement stunned the crew. It was the first on-record concession, linking him to the evidence. When asked if he could imagine who else might have written it, Durst said quietly, "Someone who cared, she'd be found." By 2014, editing of The Jinx was nearly complete. The series intercut interviews, archival footage, and police files to reconstruct every phase of Durst's life: childhood trauma, marriage, disappearance, flight, and trial, the tone oscillated between sympathy and dread. Viewers would see an aging man apparently confessing through omission. Yet there was still one unsolved riddle: the why behind Susan Berman's death. The producers decided to schedule one last interview, a final sit-down to revisit inconsistencies. On a cold day late that year, Durst arrived at a Manhattan hotel suite with his usual small briefcase, meticulous notes, and a bottle of water he insisted on pouring himself. Cameras rolled. Jarecki's opening question cut straight to the point. "We have these two envelopes, the one you definitely wrote to Susan and the one sent to police. They look identical. Can you explain that?" Durst studied them in silence for several seconds. He swallowed hard, adjusted his tie, and said, "I can't imagine writing the cadaver note because I had no reason to." Then, almost in a whisper, "It looks the same." The tension in the room shifted palpably. Jarecki pressed further. "If you did write it, what would that mean?" Durst responded, "That I was there." After the exchange ended, Durst excused himself to use the restroom, still wearing the wireless microphone. Alone behind the door, yet unaware the mic remained hot, he began muttering to himself. Editors later described hearing a long exhale followed by words that sent shockwaves through true crime history. "There it is. You're caught. What the hell did I do? Killed them all, of course." The audio, raw, eerie, almost whispered, was accidental confession and fragmented monologue mixed together. To ensure authenticity, the crew verified timecodes and storage metadata. The next steps demanded secrecy. They locked the footage in a secure drive and discreetly informed law enforcement months before airing. For detectives who had chased Durst for decades, the recording changed everything. Combined with the handwriting evidence and financial links, it justified a new arrest warrant. Before the finale of the Jinx broadcast nationally, FBI agents located Durst, staying under an alias at a New Orleans hotel. He had in his possession a loaded revolver, cash bundles exceeding $40,000, maps of Cuba, and a latex disguise. Prosecutors described it as a flight kit. When he was taken into custody, he muttered only, "You got me now." News of the arrest exploded simultaneously with the series' concluding episode. Millions of viewers watched the confession sequence, not knowing authorities had already moved. Social media reactions blurred fiction and reality. For the first time, a documentary's narrative climax aligned with a real-time capture. Inside law enforcement circles, reactions were mixed. Some hailed Jarecki's team for catalyzing justice. Others criticized the delay between recording and disclosure. Yet even skeptics acknowledged that without the program, the Susan Berman case might have remained unsolved. The televised confession forced legal reconsideration of evidence that had languished for 15 years. As pretrial hearings began, prosecutors used the Jinx both as roadmap and exhibit list. They subpoenaed raw footage, authenticated handwriting comparisons, and established motive through Durst's own words. The series' impact extended beyond courtrooms. It reignited public debate about privilege, obsession, and the spectacle of true crime. How had one man managed to manipulate wealth, media, and law enforcement for so long? Scholars noted that Durst's participation in the documentary mirrored earlier patterns, an illusion of control leading to exposure. He trusted storytelling as armor, the same way Susan Berman once used it as refuge. Both believed that by narrating events, they could define them. Instead, narrative became confession. In April 2015, excerpts of the Jinx tapes were played in closed-door grand jury sessions. Prosecutors presented the handwriting findings step by step, overlaying letter shapes, spacing ratios, and unique angles. Even without the bathroom recording, the cumulative match probability approached certainty. When the bathroom audio played, a hush reportedly filled the room. Durst's defense claimed the jury was being swayed by entertainment rather than evidence. They argued the mutterings were incoherent and possibly spliced for effect. Forensic audio experts, however, confirmed continuity. The raw feed contained pauses, but no edits. The words were genuine, spoken sequentially in real time. The trial itself would unfold years later, delayed by illness and the pandemic, but by then, the damage was irreversible. Robert Durst had confessed to the entire world, if not legally, then psychologically. His image, an aging billionaire mumbling guilt in solitude, became an emblem of hubris meeting its limit. Behind the public fascination lay quieter grief. For the families of Kathy Durst and Susan Berman, the HBO series ended what decades had denied: acknowledgement. They watched scenes of Durst describing friendship, marriage, and loss, knowing each word masked violence. For them, the film was not entertainment, it was documentation of absence. When the jinx concluded, director Andrew Jarecki appeared in interviews visibly shaken. He said he had gone into the project curious and left disturbed. Robert wanted to confess, he told one reporter, but only to the camera. That paradox captured the essence of the story, a man whose craving for recognition eclipsed his instinct for self-preservation. In examining the jinx, cultural critics observed how media can reverse justice's usual trajectory. Normally, evidence feeds news. Here, news generated evidence. The program blurred documentary ethics and criminal investigation, forcing questions about responsibility. Yet, whatever the discomfort, the outcome was undeniable. A woman's unsolved murder was no longer forgotten. Within months of broadcasting, homicide detectives in other jurisdictions adopted similar collaborations with journalists, studying how open narratives can expose dormant cases. The Durst effect, they called it, public storytelling turned forensic tool. Meanwhile, in the Los Angeles District Attorney's files, the document that had started it all, the white envelope reading Cadaver Beverly Hills, was recatalogued as primary evidence. Photos of it appeared beside courtroom exhibits, its simple block letters now infamous. For handwriting analysts, it became a benchmark case, demonstrating how minute stylistic fingerprints can survive decades. In interviews following Durst's eventual conviction, Jarecki admitted he sometimes felt haunted by the sequence of events. Susan loved stories, he said. In a way, her killer got caught because someone finally told one that could not be rewritten. From Hollywood to law enforcement academies, the jinx remains studied as a turning point, proof that facts buried in archives can resurface through cultural curiosity. For audiences, the final minutes of that series offered a moment rarely captured on film, the instant a facade collapses. A frail man whispers the truth to no one, except to a microphone swaying near the sink, and the world, at last, hears him. Los Angeles, 2020. 2 decades after the gunshot that silenced Susan Berman in her Benedict Canyon home, the case that had lingered in file cabinets returned to center stage. At the criminal courts building downtown, reporters formed lines that stretched around the block. Everyone wanted a seat inside Department 81, where 80-year-old Robert Durst, frail and masked by oxygen tubes, would finally stand trial for murder. He entered the courtroom in a wheelchair, head bowed, wearing beige jail attire. The man who had once glided through New York's elite circles now appeared diminished, but his reputation filled the room. The jury, 7 women and 5 men, studied him with uneasy fascination. When proceedings began, Senior Deputy District Attorney John Lewin rose first. He had spent years rebuilding the fractured case file. This case, he told jurors, is about loyalty, fear, and the price of silence. Lewin outlined the theory. In 2000, Susan Berman faced the moral reckoning of a lifetime. Detectives revisiting the disappearance of Kathy Durst had scheduled an interview with her. She had begun to waver about keeping her old friend's secrets. Days before that meeting, Robert Durst killed her to protect himself. The anonymous cadaver note addressed to Beverly Hills police was both confession and control, a way to ensure discovery without exposure. The prosecution promised to trace each step from the decades-old marriage in New York to the blood-stained carpet in Los Angeles. The defense, led by Dick DeGuerin, the same attorney who had secured Durst's Galveston acquittal, countered with a familiar refrain. "You will hear gossip and speculation," he told the jury. But no witness saw Robert Durst fire a gun. No fingerprints, no weapon, no DNA. They framed Susan's death as tragic but uncertain, and reminded jurors that fame does not equal guilt. The first weeks played like competing versions of a long-buried friendship. Former classmates recalled how inseparable Robert and Susan had been at UCLA. They shared apartments, meals, and confidences. One described Susan as his public defender before lawyers ever arrived. Another testified she called Durst my best friend in the world, even when his reputation turned poisonous. The portrait drawn by the state, however, was darker. A woman drowning in debt, expecting money from that same friend, and frightfully aware that police were about to question her about Kathy's disappearance. Jurors examined photographs of Susan's Benedict Canyon home, unchanged since 2000. Unopened Christmas gifts, her dog's leash near the door, and the single shell casing recovered beside a fallen paperback. The simplicity of the scene made it haunting. No struggle, no theft, precision execution. The handwriting evidence became the trial's heartbeat. Expert Lynn Goldberg projected side-by-side enlargements of the cadaver note and a 1999 envelope addressed by Durst to Susan. Each letter appeared identical in spacing and angle. When she highlighted the uncommon right-leaning capital V and the distinctive slant of the E, jurors leaned forward, These similarities, Goldberg said, are so significant that it is virtually impossible another writer produced both. Defense attorneys attempted damage control. They conceded the likelihood that Durst authored the note, but introduced an alternate narrative. He found Susan's body himself, visiting her home and discovering the crime. He panicked. Fearing he would be implicated, he mailed the note anonymously to alert authorities. To prove intent to kill, they said, prosecutors must show he had been in Los Angeles before her death, not after. That argument wavered when prosecutors displayed bank records of a $25,000 wire transfer dated 2 days before the homicide. Airline tickets placed Durst traveling from the Bay Area to Los Angeles around that same time, under an alias. Motel staff from Ventura County identified him from photographs. No single document sealed proof of murder, but together they mapped proximity. One of the trial's most emotional testimonies came from Nick Chavin, a longtime friend of both Durst and Berman. Chavin testified that in 2014, during dinner in New York, he asked Durst directly about Susan. He looked at me and said, "I had to. It was her or me." The courtroom froze. Chavin's voice shook as he repeated the words. The defense attacked credibility, calling him forgetful, but jurors saw his unease as authenticity rather than performance. Midway through the proceedings, prosecutors played excerpts from The Jinx. The large monitor flickered to Durst's face. Older, composed, unaware of the future trial audience, jurors watched him study photos of the cadaver note. They heard him say, "Looks like something I would write." Then came the infamous bathroom whisper, "Killed them all, of course." Gasps rippled through spectators, though many knew it from television. Defense lawyers objected furiously, calling it entertainment, not evidence. Yet the judge ruled its inclusion proper context for consciousness of guilt. The moment shifted energy inside the courtroom. Even those previously skeptical began studying Durst's detached expression for hints of confession. Witness after witness described Susan's final weeks. Friends recounted nervous phone calls, her talk about upcoming interviews with New York police, her gratitude for a recent check from Robert. One friend, journalist Myrna Loy, said Susan promised she would absolutely tell the truth to investigators, but had not yet decided what that meant. The prosecution argued that ambiguity sealed her fate. Durst could not risk discovering what version she would tell. The defense paraded handwriting experts of their own to contest the prosecution's analysis, but failed to dismantle the overwhelming similarity scores. They focused instead on attacking the credibility of the HBO sequence, suggesting manipulative editing. One expert claimed Durst's muttered remark might have meant, "They will kill them all, of course," implying paranoia about prosecutors, not confession. The passing of syllables struck jurors as desperate. As weeks stretched into months, the trial's atmosphere alternated between circus and funeral. COVID protocols, limited spectators, forcing journalists to rotate through viewing rooms. Durst, increasingly frail, sometimes dozed at counsel's table. When awake, he scribbled notes with a trembling hand, occasionally glancing toward the jury, but never expressing visible emotion. Lewin's closing argument adopted deliberate calm. "Robert Durst has been running for nearly 40 years, he said. 3 people linked by trust are now gone. Kathy Durst vanished. Susan Berman executed. Morris Black dismembered. Only one common denominator connects them." He pointed toward the defense table. "It ends here." De Guerin followed with a counter-refrain of reasonable doubt. "The prosecution gave you headlines, not proof. Speculation, not science. Do not confuse a TV show with evidence." He invoked Durst's age and ailments, portraying a frail old man hunted by fame. The jury began deliberations on September 8, 2021. Over 3 days, they reviewed the video evidence, forensic exhibits, and travel logs. According to later interviews, 2 points decided consensus: the handwriting match and Durst's own recorded words. On September 17th, their verdict returned: guilty of first-degree murder, with special circumstances of witness killing. Durst showed no reaction as the clerk read the result. His eyes remained fixed forward, unblinking. Around the room, muffled sobs came from Susan Berman's friends, who had waited 20 years for acknowledgement. Outside, reporters rushed to file stories. A Los Angeles Times headline later summarized it simply, "Durst convicted, truth catches up." During sentencing in October 2021, the judge called the crime chilling in its calculation. He imposed life imprisonment without parole. When offered the chance to speak, Durst whispered hoarsely through a mask, "I did not kill Susan Berman." Few believed him. For prosecutors and investigators, the outcome carried vindication tempered by melancholy. Evidence had won, but too late for full justice. Susan's parents, most witnesses, and even Kathy Durst's advocates had aged or died waiting. Outside the courthouse, lead detective Paul Coulter addressed microphones. "She was my first victim, whose dog I ever met the day we found her," he said. "I never forgot that dog's eyes. Today, we finally kept a promise to her owner." Reporters asked whether prosecutors might file additional charges related to Kathy Durst. Investigators confirmed ongoing coordination with New York authorities. But time was closing in. Barely 4 months after sentencing, Durst's lawyers announced he had been hospitalized with severe illness. On January 10, 2022, he died at age 78, ending decades of speculation without personal disclosure. In retrospect, the trial served less as punishment than as record, a meticulous reconstruction, ensuring Susan Berman would no longer exist merely as mobster's daughter or victim linked to Durst. Her writing, once forgotten in used book bins, saw new readership. Easy Street was republished, its introduction noting that her voice finally speaks louder than the man who silenced her. At her gravestone in Las Vegas, visitors sometimes leave pens or small notebooks instead of flowers. The inscription remains unchanged. Writer and friend. To the detectives who solved her murder, those words now hold a different meaning. She was a writer whose story helped expose accountability, and a friend whose loyalty, however tragic, ultimately pointed the way to truth. In courtrooms, handwriting charts fade to exhibits and recordings gather dust, but behind every piece of evidence lies a voice cut short. In the end, that voice, not the confession, not the documentary, was what the jury heard. 20 years late, Susan Berman finally had the last word. The story that began in glittering penthouses and sun-bleached streets ended in a hospital prison ward. Robert Durst, the heir who inherited control, spent his last days watched by guards, whispering to lawyers who no longer argued. With his death, the Durst dynasty finally confronted what money could not buy: silence that stays permanent. Susan Berman's murder had exposed not only a man's crimes, but a culture that confused wealth with consequence. For decades, Susan stood by a friend she believed troubled, but misunderstood. That loyalty, forged from shared isolation, became the fault line running through every tragedy attached to his name. In Chasing Meaning, she wrote about loyalty as virtue. In life, it proved fatal. The note that announced her death also unmasked the illusion, shielding the man she defended. The Durst family released brief statements of sympathy but avoided reflection. Skyscrapers still bear their name, glass reaching toward the sky as if insisting success erases memory. Yet beneath those towers lingers the cold truth uncovered by detectives and storytellers alike. Privilege can delay justice, but it cannot erase it entirely. For investigators, writers, and audiences drawn to this case, closure remains complicated. Susan's story is no longer only about betrayal or wealth. It is about how truth endures through persistence, art, and a few misspelled letters on a simple envelope. Each piece of evidence, her voice, her trust, the handwriting became a fragment, restoring humanity to a woman long reduced to a footnote. Her death marked the end of the Durst illusion, but her words outlived it. The daughter of Las Vegas casinos and Hollywood dreams turned her final chapter into revelation. In the quiet, where her typewriter once stood, the moral remains. Secrets survive years, but stories last longer.